The Forest Walk. When we open our homes to strangers, we make ourselves vulnerable in ways we rarely consider. We share our most private spaces, our routines, our moments of weakness. Most of the time, this trust is rewarded with friendship, or at least peaceful coexistence. But sometimes, we invite something much darker through our doors. Marcus thought he had it all figured out. Fresh out of college, he and 3 other graduates had found the perfect solution to post-graduation life: a small house on the rural outskirts of the city, rent split 4 ways, everyone starting their adult lives together. They barely knew each other beyond shared hallways and lecture halls, but that seemed like enough. For 9 months, it was enough. The house filled with laughter, late-night conversations, and the comfortable chaos of young adults finding their footing. Then, almost overnight, 2 of his roommates announced they were moving out. Different jobs, different cities, different dreams pulling them away. That left Marcus alone with KJ, the one roommate he'd barely spoken to in all those months. KJ was a ghost in their shared space, always working his part-time morning shifts, then vanishing until the early hours of the next day. Marcus had assumed he was social, just not with them. Now, with the house echoing with emptiness, that assumption felt increasingly hollow. The rent doubled overnight. 3 months left on the lease, then they'd go their separate ways. Marcus could handle 3 months of anything, even awkward silence and loneliness. What he couldn't handle was what he discovered during those long, solitary days and nights. KJ wasn't social. KJ wasn't visiting friends or exploring the city or living any kind of normal life that Marcus could understand. KJ was simply absent. Gone from morning until the darkest hours of night, returning home with the stealth of someone who didn't want to be noticed. It was 1 a.m. when the headlights finally swept across Marcus's bedroom window. The familiar crunch of gravel under tires, the careful click of the front door. Marcus had been lying in bed, half asleep, when something made him sit up. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the loneliness of the past month finally getting to him. He opened his bedroom door, ready to offer a simple hello, maybe break through the wall of awkwardness that had grown between them. Instead, he froze. KJ was rushing down the hallway in the darkness, his footsteps urgent, almost frantic. When he saw Marcus, he stopped dead, his eyes wide and wild in the dim light. There was something wrong with his expression, something that made Marcus's skin crawl. "What's up, KJ?" "Just seeing how you're doing," Marcus managed, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. KJ just stared. Those wide eyes, that frozen posture, the way he stood there in the dark hallway like a deer caught in headlights. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless. "I'm good." The silence stretched between them until Marcus retreated to his room, his heart beating faster than it should have been. Through his door, he could hear KJ moving around frantically, drawers opening and slamming shut, the sound of someone searching desperately for something. Or hiding something. The chaos stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt oppressive. Marcus found himself holding his breath, waiting for something he couldn't name. That's when KJ's door swung open, and those same wild eyes found him again, boring into him through the darkness. For the next week, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. KJ's behavior grew more erratic, more disturbing. The late-night returns, the zombie-like state, the way he barely seemed human anymore. Then came the knock on Marcus's bedroom door at 1 a.m., 7 days after that first encounter. KJ stood there with that same unsettling stare, but now there was something else. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I just got home and I think I dropped my wallet out in the driveway," KJ said, his voice carefully controlled. "Do you have a flashlight? Could you help me find it?" It was such a normal request. Such a human thing to ask. But something about the way KJ said it, the timing, the forced casualness of it all, made every instinct Marcus had scream in warning. Still, when someone asks for help, you help. That's what decent people do. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and followed KJ out into the night, not knowing he was walking towards something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Into the darkness. The gravel crunched under their feet as they walked down the long driveway, Marcus's flashlight cutting through the darkness. KJ was making small talk, asking about work, acting almost normal for the first time in weeks. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to relax. Maybe this was just what it seemed, a simple favor between roommates. Then he noticed where KJ's car was parked. It sat at the very end of the driveway, as far from the house as possible. If KJ had really dropped his wallet walking from the car to the front door, they shouldn't need to walk this far. But KJ kept leading them forward, past the car, toward the tree line that marked the beginning of the woods surrounding their isolated house. "Why is your car parked way out here?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice casual. KJ took a few seconds too long to answer. "I went for a short walk earlier when I got home. Wanted to clear my head. I could have dropped it out here." The light felt thick in the night air between them. Marcus swept the flashlight beam across the ground, but they were moving away from any logical path KJ might have taken. They were heading deeper into the woods, further from safety, further from witnesses. Every time Marcus suggested they turn back, KJ found another reason to keep going. Maybe it was a little further. Maybe they should check by that tree. Maybe. The word became a mantra of manipulation, each suggestion leading them deeper into darkness. Marcus felt his chest tighten with growing panic. This wasn't about a lost wallet. This had never been about a lost wallet. KJ's behavior over the past weeks, the wild eyes, the secretive late-night activities, it was all leading to this moment. This place. This isolation. "Here, you can take the flashlight," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm going to head back to the house. I've got to be up early for work anyway." He held out the flashlight, but KJ didn't take it. The fake smile that had been plastered on his face fell away, replaced by something cold and angry. In the weak light, Marcus could see KJ's hands clenched into fists, his posture tense with barely contained rage. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken threats. Marcus felt every muscle in his body coil with the need to run, but he forced himself to move slowly, deliberately. Don't show fear. Don't trigger whatever was building in KJ's mind. He turned and walked back toward the house, fighting the urge to break into a sprint. Behind him, he could feel KJ watching, could sense that predatory stillness of someone deciding whether to strike. The flashlight beam bounced with each step, casting wild shadows that seemed to reach for him from the forest floor. When he looked back, KJ was still standing there among the trees, a silhouette against the darkness, perfectly still. Watching. Waiting. Marcus didn't stop moving until he reached the house. Then he started packing. He threw clothes into bags, grabbed important documents, cleared out anything that mattered. He'd figure out the lease later, find somewhere else to sleep. All that mattered was getting away from KJ and whatever he'd been planning in those woods. KJ never came back to the house that night. Marcus sat by the window, watching the tree line, his packed bags by the door. When dawn finally broke, he loaded his car and drove away from that house forever. Years later, Marcus still wonders what would have happened if he'd followed KJ deeper into those woods. He's grateful he never found out. But his story is just the beginning. Sometimes the danger doesn't come from the roommate you barely know. Sometimes it comes from someone who should never have been your roommate at all. Dave thought he knew his roommate Jason well. They'd shared a dorm room in college, lived together peacefully for over a year. When they decided to rent a house together after graduation, it seemed like the natural next step. They were comfortable with each other, compatible, safe. The footsteps started in June, 2 months after they'd renewed their lease. The shadow in the hall. Dave woke to the sound of creaking floorboards at 3 a.m. The old house settled and groaned in familiar ways, but this was different. This was the slow, deliberate sound of someone moving through the hallway, heading toward the main living area. He rolled over and checked the clock, assuming Jason was getting water or couldn't sleep. It didn't seem worth investigating. In the morning, though, Jason looked tired and asked Dave an unexpected question. "What were you doing walking around the house in the middle of the night?" Dave stared at him. "I wasn't. I thought that was you." They stood there in the kitchen, both confused, both certain they'd heard someone moving through their home. Dave suggested it might have been the house settling, maybe wind against the walls. Old houses made strange noises. It was probably nothing.
But the next night, it happened again.
Same time, same slow progression through the hallway. This time, Dave forced himself to listen more carefully. The sound was too rhythmic, too purposeful to be random settling.
Someone was walking through their house.
He got up and crept to the living room, but found nothing.
No Jason, no obvious explanation for what he'd heard.
Just the empty darkness of their shared space, suddenly feeling less safe than it had the day before. When he mentioned it to Jason again, neither of them had answers. The mystery hung between them, an unsettling question mark in what had been a comfortable living situation.
Dave had to work late the next day, not getting home until nearly 11 p.m.
As he walked down the hallway to his room, he saw Jason sitting on his bed, visible through the open doorway. Dave called out a greeting as he passed, but Jason didn't respond. Maybe he had headphones in, or was focused on something.
Dave went to his room, changed clothes, then headed to the kitchen for a late dinner.
When he passed Jason's room again, the light was off, but Jason was still sitting there in the same position, now barely visible in the darkness.
"Hey, what's up, Jason? You all right?" Dave called out. No response. Just that still figure sitting in the corner of the darkened room.
It was strange enough that Dave felt uncomfortable, but not strange enough to justify walking into his roommate's bedroom uninvited.
He left Jason alone and went to make his food, trying to shake off the odd feeling the interaction had given him. An hour later, Dave was in his room when he heard the familiar sound of footsteps in the hallway.
But this time, something moved under his door, a shadow blocking the light from the hallway.
Someone was standing right outside his room. He grabbed his phone and sent Jason a quick text, asking if he was the one walking around. The response came back immediately, a question mark, followed by, "What do you mean? I'm not home right now." Dave's blood ran cold. He stared at his phone, then at his door, where the shadow was still visible in the crack underneath. If Jason wasn't home, then who had been sitting in his room? Who was standing outside Dave's door right now?
He got up and stepped into the hallway, his heart pounding. No one was there, but Jason's door was open again.
Dave approached slowly, peering into the darkened room.
A man stood in the center of the space, taller than Jason, with a thick beard that Jason had never had. In the darkness, Dave could see enough to know this was a complete stranger, someone who had no business being in their house. The man was facing him, aware of his presence, but made no move to explain himself or leave. For a terrifying moment, they just stared at each other across the threshold of the bedroom.
Then Dave ran.
He sprinted out of the house and called the police from across the street, his hands shaking as he dialed.
When officers arrived, the intruder was gone.
They found no signs of forced entry, just a partially unlocked window that didn't appear to have been opened recently. The investigation revealed something chilling. The creaking footsteps Dave and Jason had been hearing for days weren't from each other. They were from this unknown man, walking through their house in the middle of the night while they slept, completely unaware of his presence. Even more disturbing was trying to understand why he'd been in Jason's room, sitting on his bed, seemingly waiting. The timing suggested he knew Jason's schedule, knew when he'd be alone in the house.
If Jason hadn't decided to visit a friend that night, what would have happened? Dave and Jason moved out within the week, but the questions followed them. Who was that man? How long had he been entering their home? What had he been planning?
Sometimes the most dangerous roommate is the one you never invited in. But sometimes, the person you do invite turns out to be someone else entirely. In 2015, Sarah was looking for a roommate to share her apartment. She posted on Craigslist, which seemed normal back then, safer than it would be today. She was specific about what she wanted: someone close to her age, someone responsible, someone who could be trusted with shared living space.
Hannah seemed perfect. 23, still in college, mature and responsible in their phone conversations.
When she came to tour the apartment, everything felt right. They agreed on terms quickly, and within a week, Hannah had moved in.
That's when Sarah noticed Hannah didn't quite look 23. The Watcher.
Hannah was taller than Sarah had expected, with a mature, weathered look that seemed older than her claimed age.
But people aged differently, Sarah reasoned. Some 23-year-olds looked like teenagers, others looked 30. It wasn't necessarily a red flag.
The real red flags came later. For the first few days, they barely saw each other.
Sarah worked full days while Hannah juggled college and a part-time job.
It seemed like an ideal roommate situation, two busy people sharing space without getting in each other's way. On the fifth day, Sarah came home from work around 10 p.m. to the sound of rushing footsteps and a slamming door. She dropped her bag and looked down the hallway toward their bedrooms.
Hannah's door was closed with the light on, but Sarah's door was open.
She distinctly remembered closing it before leaving for work that morning. Sarah went to her room and looked around, but nothing seemed disturbed or out of place. Maybe she'd forgotten to close the door, or maybe Hannah had needed something and was too embarrassed to ask.
Sarah decided to let it go, not wanting to create conflict so early in their living arrangement. She settled in for the evening, watching TV in her room. For over an hour, she didn't hear any movement from Hannah's room.
Then, glancing at her bedroom door out of habit, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach drop. There was a shadow under the crack, perfectly still.
Someone was standing just outside her door, not moving, not making any sound. Just standing there. "Hannah?" Sarah called out. The shadow didn't move. "Hannah, are you out there?"
Several long seconds passed before the shadow finally shifted, moving away from the door and down the hallway.
Hannah's bedroom door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the walls. Sarah's heart was racing. What had Hannah been doing, standing outside her door like that? How long had she been there?
Sarah locked her bedroom door that night, something she'd never felt the need to do before. In the morning, she gently asked Hannah if she'd needed something the night before.
Hannah just smiled and said everything was fine, ending the conversation immediately.
It was polite but dismissive, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers. The next night, Sarah came home to a dark, quiet apartment. All the lights were off, including in Hannah's room, so she assumed her roommate was already asleep. Sarah went to her room quietly, not wanting to wake her, and settled in for the night. After a video call with a friend, Sarah decided to take a shower. While she was in there, she thought she heard something from her bedroom, but when she turned down the water to listen, everything was quiet. When she got out of the shower and looked into her bedroom, her door to the hallway was open.
Sarah was almost certain she'd locked it when she got home.
Almost certain, but not completely sure. The apartment was still dark and quiet, as if Hannah had never left her room.
But if Hannah was asleep, who had opened the door?
Sarah closed and locked it again, more carefully this time, making sure she'd remember. She tried to watch TV to calm down, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong.
When she finally went to bed, exhaustion overtook paranoia.
She fell asleep quickly, deeply, but woke up what felt like moments later to complete darkness and perfect silence. Her door was cracked open. Just a few inches, but enough to let her know that someone had been in her room while she slept.
"Hannah," she whispered into the darkness.
The silence felt heavy, oppressive, like it was pressing down on her chest. Sarah sat up, staring at that crack in the door, feeling like she was being watched through it. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she looked around her room and froze. Hannah was standing in the corner near the wardrobe, perfectly still, facing Sarah's bed. She wasn't moving or speaking, just staring with that same blank expression she'd had in the hallway days before. They looked at each other across the dark room, Sarah's heart hammering so loud she was sure Hannah could hear it. Then Hannah took a step forward, her face still eerily expressionless, like she was sleepwalking or in some kind of trance. Another step. Then she suddenly ran across the room and out into the hallway, her bedroom door slamming behind her. Sarah grabbed her phone and car keys and ran from the apartment. She didn't stop until she was blocks away, parked in a strange neighborhood, calling the police with shaking hands. When officers arrived at her apartment 15 minutes later, Hannah was gone. Not just gone from the apartment, but vanished completely, taking most of her belongings with her. That's when they discovered the truth. All the information Sarah had about Hannah was fabricated. The name didn't match any records. The phone number belonged to a prepaid burner with no identity attached. Even Hannah's age and college enrollment were lies. Sarah had been living with a complete stranger who had constructed an entirely false identity to gain access to her home, her space, her life. Someone who had spent weeks studying her routines, watching her sleep, planning something that Sarah was lucky never to discover. To this day, nearly a decade later, Sarah has never heard from or seen Hannah again. The woman simply vanished back into whatever life she'd been living before she decided to become someone else. These three stories share a common thread that goes beyond the surface horror of dangerous roommates. They're about trust, about the leap of faith we take when we share our most private spaces with others. They're about the masks people wear in the darkness that can hide behind even the most normal-seeming interactions. Marcus never found out what KJ was planning in those woods. Dave never learned why a stranger was sitting in his roommate's bedroom, waiting. Sarah never discovered what Hannah intended during those weeks of surveillance and deception. Maybe it's better that way. Maybe some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, their answers too dark to bear knowing. But these stories serve as reminders that our homes are only as safe as the people we allow into them. And sometimes, the greatest danger comes not from the stranger on the street, but from the person sleeping in the room next door. Thank you for following these three stories to the end. If these cases moved you, hit like and subscribe. We have more stories that deserve to be heard. Share your thoughts, your feelings, and your theories in the comments below. What do you think KJ was planning? Who was the man in Jason's room? What were Hannah's real intentions? The answers may be lost to time, but the questions will stay with us forever.